Okay, everyone, can you see my slide okay?
Yes.
And can you hear me? Good. Right. Thanks, Neil. And also, if John's still there, just to say it was a brilliant talk, John, and I really enjoyed it. And hopefully, Linda and I will get back to Tyree in the next year or so. So my talk tonight is about birding in Glasgow during the lockdown period, basically, because quite a number of things happened. And as John has said, that being on Tyree and being on a small island, a small patch, it's amazing what turns up. And that certainly happened in Glasgow over the past 18 months or so. So just for this particular talk, and I know maybe technically it's not totally accurate, but I'm defining lockdown as the period from the 1st of April in 2020 to the 30th of September 2021. I'm only going to refer to birds that I saw myself. I'm not going to talk about birds that some other birders in the Glasgow area managed to find and see, and I failed to see. And all the photos are my own, and were actually taken at the specified location during the lockdown period. So I may have better quality photographs of some of the species, but if it was pouring with rain when I took the photograph, that's the photograph I'm going to share with you. So hopefully you get an idea also of the reality of birding. It's not all like David Attenborough and close-ups of birds. Sometimes you've got to work hard just to get a glimpse of a bird. So here we go. So obviously, during the lockdown period, I was limited to where I could visit. So I could easily walk to Bingham's Pond and also Dawson Park Local Nature Reserve. They're very close to our house. So as part of my daily exercise, I visited these locations on a regular basis. And indeed, over the period in question, I visited Bingham's Pond 93 times, the first time being on the 3rd of April. And I visited Dawson Park 35 times, with the first time being on the 1st of April. Later on, we were able to go a wee bit further, provided we stayed within the City Council boundary. And I visited Frankfield Loch, which is a proposed local nature reserve, just east of Hugginfield Loch. I've only visited it 8 times, once at the beginning in September 2020. And then obviously Hugginfield Park Local Nature Reserve, which everyone knows is my most favoured location in central Scotland. 78 visits, with the first visit though not being till the 30th of June because of the travel issues. So for those of you who don't know, Bingham's Pond is actually a proposed local nature reserve. This has been a lobby. We've lobbied as a Friends of group, Friends of Glasgow's Local Nature Reserve. Neil mentioned I'm the chair of it. We've been lobbying now for a year or two that Bingham's Pond should be upgraded to local nature reserve status. And certainly during the lockdown, it was extremely popular with local people. And for those who don't know, it's actually sandwiched between the Great Western Road and Gartnavel Hospital in the West End of Glasgow. So in this period, I saw 54 species of bird. Now, you just saw the photograph there. It's just quite a small pond, really, surrounded by a bit of grassland and some trees, although one area does have a lot of sort of bramble and other sort of undergrowth. So I got the usual wetland bird species, but you might be surprised to find that tree creeper could be found in the trees there. Blackcap and some other summer migrants could be seen. And this little bird here, which some of you may think it's a blue tit, but it's actually a young grey wagtail. Grey wagtails bred in the area, and the adults brought the young to the pond, and they could be seen both in the trees and on the edges of the pond, feeding voraciously on insects. Now, as I've said, it's a great place for wetland birds. So in this slide here, the pond froze over in winter in part, but thanks to local people feeding the swans, the mallard, the tufted duck, the coot, the moorhen, and the various gulls, there was always some open water available. And that proved actually quite crucial, because I went down to the pond to hopefully find some ringed gulls. For those who've heard me doing another short talk, I've become addicted to reading the rings of various gull species and finding out where the gulls are from. So I went down in middle of January, I think it was the 12th of January, down to the pond, and sure enough, there was a ringed black-headed gull. And this one, funnily enough, was ringed at Victoria Park. in 2018. This one was ringed at Elven Foot in South Lanarkshire in 2020. And this one was ringed at the Moorfoots in the Borders, south of Edinburgh, in 2020 as well. So right away, my theory of finding ringed black-headed gulls proved to be worthwhile. I also had this vague notion, a bit of a wish, that a bird that had been seen regularly in northwest Glasgow over the autumn and early winter at the various lochs and reservoirs in Bearsden and Mulgai would miraculously turn up somewhere in Glasgow where there was open water, because these reservoirs and ponds and lochs in Bearsden and Mulgai had all frozen over. And I was counting the black-headed, the tufted ducks rather, when and all the other species there, because I think it was a wildfowl count day as well. So as I've said before, you've got a variety of ducks there, mute swan, various gulls, but this bird suddenly appeared in amongst the tufted ducks, at which point I said, goodness gracious me, isn't that an awfully pretty little duck? I am so pleased. Or words to that effect. So this ring-necked duck, and John Bowler, I don't know if he's still watching, he showed a photograph of him in Tiree. Well, the ring-necked duck stayed at Bingham's Pond, and for that matter, it moved on to Victoria Park Pond occasionally. But it stayed, I found it in January, and it stayed until mid-April 2021. And John mentioned the fact that it's incorrectly named. It should be called a ring-billed duck. But if you look very closely, you'll see why it's called a ring-necked duck. It's got this little purple ring that you can only see when it really stretches. And surprise, surprise, the locals dubbed it Ringo, and it became a local celebrity. And the number of people that came up to me when I was bird watching said, I don't know if you know, but there's a ring-necked duck out there in the pond. So it was quite great to hear people who were casual bird watchers or not even bird watchers. They came to feed the ducks or whatever, but they were all taken by this ring-necked duck and the fact that it had come from North America to visit a little pond in the west end of Glasgow. And of course, it was a first for Glasgow. Although they've been seen, as I say, in Bearsden and Mulgai and other locations, it was a first for Glasgow. So I was really quite pleased to find that. So that's the end of the little story of Bingham's Pond, because I've got half an hour to go through all these species, and I'll move on now to Dawsholme Park, another one that I was able to visit from April onwards, and it's sandwiched between the River Kelvin and Temple Road. It's owned by the Glasgow City Council, and I must say over the lockdown period they have improved access, and the paths are virtually mud-free now, which is great. For those of you who don't know the park, it's got some grassland that's grazed by Highland cattle. It's got some parkland trees. It's a sort of mature woodland. It's on the edge of the River Kelvin, and it's got a pond as well. So it's a typical old sort of woodland, and as such, you get typical woodland species. So in the period in question, I've seen 53 bird species at the park. As I've said, it's a typical woodland, so you see typical woodland birds. Also some species that have arrived in recent years, and this unexpected oyster catcher, which was sort of feeding on some of the grassland within the park. I believe they breed nearby on some of the flats that have got flat roofs. But as I said, some new species that have arrived recently are now colonising the park, and this is a nuthatch. It did try to nest in that nest hole, but in later weeks I saw great tits coming out of it. So obviously the nuthatch decided it wasn't for them, as it were, and the great tits moved in. But the nuthatches did nest in one of the Svegler nest boxes that were erected by the Friends of Glasgow's local nature reserve, and that's the third year running that nuthatches have used this particular nest box. So we're really quite proud and pleased that nuthatches have chosen one of our boxes to nest in. Other species that have moved into the park, previously the only known breeding site of ring-necked parakeet were Victoria Park, but the population is growing and growing, and now there's, I would suggest, 3 to 4 pairs, if not 5 pairs of ring-necked parakeets now nesting at Dawsholme. And again, like the ring-necked duck, the number of people who stop me to say, I don't know if you know, son. Now, first of all, I'm really surprised that they called me son since I'm nearly 70, but they call me son and say, do you know there's ring-necked parakeets in the park, son? And they nest in that tree up there. And I say, aye, that's why I've got my camera. No. So, but it's really great again that locals have totally adopted the ring-necked parakeet, and hopefully rumours of its culling are just that, just rumours. And the final species that I never thought I would ever see in Glasgow is jay, and I've seen them more often now in Dossholm than probably the other 30 years that I've been birdwatching at Dossholm put together. And in my last visit just a few days ago, I saw 4 jays. So not the easiest bird to photograph. They keep just flying away as I'm about to click, but I managed to get this one in very poor light. So you can see the little jay cloth patch on its wing there. So that's Dossholm Park, sort of complete. So only 2 more sites to go, folks. So bear with me. So Frankfield Loch is a proposed local nature reserve. This one's got a long history, which could take up about 2 hours of the talk. So I've only got half an hour. Suffice to say, it's located within the city of Glasgow. But the land in the loch was gifted to North Lanarkshire Council in 2020 by the house builders who bought the loch along with the surrounding land. The housing is all in North Lanarkshire. Glasgow City Council wanted this loch as a local nature reserve, so a deal has been done between the City Council and North Lanarkshire that this loch will be declared as a local nature reserve. And it's not unusual for land out with another area to be declared. Glasgow stamps the Darnley Local Nature Reserve. Part of the land area is actually in East Renfrewshire Council. So both councils declared all of the land as a local nature reserve. So you will have a situation here, probably as Glasgow City Council will have to do the declaration of the local nature reserve, whilst North Lanarkshire will do the management. But more importantly, it's a very shallow loch which attracts a variety of excellent wetland birds. So I only visited there a few times, actually. I only visited Frankfield 8 times during this period. But during these 8 times, I saw 30 bird species. As I said, typical wetland birds. So gadwall, shoveler, mute swan, coot, great crested grebe, water rail, they all breed there. And in this photograph, you can see 2 common sandpipers. Over the autumn, there in September, there were up to 4 common sandpipers that could be seen. And recently there was lots of mud, although with the heavy rain recently, the mud has disappeared, although there's still small parts available just now. But this is where some of the rarities have turned up, because it's one of the few places within the city boundary that has vast expanses of mud. And this was a rough I found a few weeks ago in September. As you can see, it's a sort of it's a wading bird, and slightly smaller bill than the red shank and curlew and all these type of waders. But it's a cracking bird to find within the city boundary. And here you've got lapwings to the left and the right, and then 2 birds in the middle. The one to the left is a dunlin, and the one to the right is a pectoral sandpiper. And I know it's an awful photograph, but the days I've visited Frankfield, it's been cloudy, it's been raining. Ian Fulton has a tremendous photograph of one of the pectoral sandpipers. But amazingly, the same way John mentioned the number of pectoral sandpipers, there were 4 pectoral sandpipers on one memorable day. Again, as I say, in September, which for those who saw these birds, it must have been an amazing sight. And on 2 occasions, I got an osprey, and I'm afraid this bird got so close overhead, and I was trying to adjust the zoom that I didn't really get a very good photograph of it. That's pondweed from its talons. It's not string or some sort of a rope or anything that's tied around its talons. That was because it made about 3 unsuccessful attempts to catch a fish in the loch. And as I say, it was the second on two separate visits within the same week. An osprey was hunting at Frankfield Loch, having been seen by other birders at the Gad Loch and nearby Bishop Loch and the Gartloch pools. So certainly ospreys are starting to use the lochs and pools in the northeast of Glasgow on a more regular basis over the autumn period, and one wonders when they start to settle down a bit closer to Glasgow in the next year or 2. So it's another view of Frankfield Loch. Again, you'll see that it's you can see it's shallow, and that's really the end of the Frankfield Loch story. So we're moving on to my favourite place, and I could have given a talk basically on Hoggenfield Park Local Nature Reserve. Um, if you haven't heard me talk about it before, I'll be amazed, but it is located just to the northeast of Glasgow city centre. It's owned by the Glasgow City Council, and it's one of the best bird watching sites in central Scotland. I think the bird list is about 170, 174. It's something amazing list for an urban, basically a park within a city. I've personally seen, I think it's about 115, 120 species, and which again is really, I think, an amazing total for a park. A lot of people think it's just got a loch, but it's got this sort of pondy area. It's got a lot of reed mace, bulrush surrounding the loch, sort of marshy area. It's got a lot of scrub. It's got woodland, and it's got grassland that are managed as wildflower meadows by the council. So it does have a lot of habitats. It's not just the open water of the loch or the trees on the island. So you have to bear that in mind when you think about the number and range of species that can be found. So I'm going to work my way through the species. And basically during this period, 1st of April to the 30th of September, I saw 97 species of bird. And these included a number of unusual species and a few rarities. But again, like Bingham's Pond, Huggenfield Loch froze over as well. And that meant you could get really close views of widgeon that arrived, which hadn't previously been on the loch. There was gadwall in this photograph. There's gadwall. There's the whooper swans. We've got up to 30 winter at Huggenfield most years, and I believe 3 have come in recent days. There's tufted duck here. There's moorhen. There's coot. And various species of gull. So there is a big wide range of wildfowl and wetland birds to be seen there. I've done the wetland birds count there on a couple of occasions when Sandy McNeil couldn't do it. And to count hundreds of birds, I mean, 200 odd mute swans, there was 300 grey lag geese and 100 Canada geese, plus all the tufted ducks, over 300, pochard about 20, etc. So it was a bit of an effort, but very worthwhile. So we'll move on to the unusual species that I've seen, and we'll also work our way through the rarities as well. So moving on to the scrub and grassland area, stone chats could be seen, not on every visit, I would stress, not on every visit. So for example, stone chat, in terms of all the visits that I made, and as I've said, I made 78 visits to Huggenfield. Stone chat was only seen on 5 occasions. So it's not something you're going to turn up and see every time, and that's why I've put it here. So when I say unusual, I would stress it's unusual in the context of a city or Huggenfield. They might be common on Mull or Loch of Strathbeg, for the sake of argument, or the south coast of England. But from a Glasgow perspective, and certainly from a Huggenfield Park perspective, they're unusual or indeed rare. And in case of the rarities, they're rare in the Clyde context, if not even the Scottish context. So whin-chat, this is another bird that was seen on passage, and only one occasion this year. Again, popping up in almost the same bush that stone chat has appeared on. And so I was quite pleased to get the whin-chat on the one occasion. Grasshopper warblers, they breed, and I would think there's about 2 or 3 pairs in the area. So I heard or saw them on 8 occasions. As you know, they're a skulking species and very difficult to photograph, but I think I managed to get a reasonable shot there of one of the birds that were reeling in the park over this summer. Skylark, the council has been managing one of the meadows specifically for, or in the hope of skylark would come back to the park as a breeding species. Now you can see here there's a wee bit of scattering of water oblique hailstones come snow, and the skylark was feeding on this particular cut area, and early in the spring, and it was the same day as I was helping a BBC cameraman do some wildfowl filming at the loch, and I could hear a skylark, so I went up and it landed to feed, and I managed to get some video and some reasonable photographs of it. Skylarks were there for a number of occasions during the spring, singing. Um, the downside of the location it had picked is it's one where a lot of people do take their dogs to walk, and they do let them off the leash. And I'd be surprised if the skylarks did breed or successfully breed. But it was great to see them back on what I would call a regular basis again this past spring. This was a big surprise, and these are a pair of tree pipits, which turned up in part of the mature woodland, and I hoped they would stay. I spoke to John Malloy, who, as most of you know, is one of the local experts, and he said he'd forecast that tree pipits would turn up in this area as the habitat was perfect for them, and we hoped that they might stay around to breed, but this turned out to be just a one-off sighting. But it really was quite pleasing again to see a passage migrant like the tree pipit, presumably moving up to the Loch Lomond area, etc., to breed. White wagtail, which is the main race of wagtail. Our pied wagtail is a subspecies, I think that's the right phrase, and pied wagtails are regularly seen at Huckenfield, but we did have a couple of weeks where the white wagtails could easily be seen, particularly along the sandy beach area that is located on one side of the loch. Common sandpipers. So moving on to waders now, having gone through the obvious passerines, we're moving on to waders, and common sandpipers occurred quite regularly, and indeed last year were so regularly sighted, I did wonder whether they might have tried to breed somewhere along the loch edge. Not all of the loch edge is accessible by human beings or even by dogs for that reason. And they were seen in spring, they were seen in summer, and they were seen in autumn at the loch. So I wouldn't be surprised if they attempted to breed. This year, I only saw them on what I would call passage, both spring and autumn. Snipe. This amuses me in that during 2020, when I was going for a record number of species in 1 year, I couldn't find a snipe for love or money. And the first day I went to Huckenfield in 2021, there was a snipe sitting out on the ice at the pond area, and it was sort of quite ironic that 2 days after the end of the year, as it were, a snipe became one of the first species for the new year. This was a real surprise. Now, you saw the photograph with the lapwings at Frankfield. Now, you can get about 300 odd lapwing in autumn at Frankfield Loch, and as the crow flies, probably Frankfield Loch is about 3 minutes from Huckenfield Loch. And I've seen lapwing fly over Huckenfield, around the island, along with gulls, and then fly back to Frankfield. We've always worked on the assumption that something like a peregrine or an osprey or something has flushed all the birds off Frankfield. They've all flown over towards Huckenfield, flown around a few times, and then flown back to Frankfield. But this lapwing was walking around the edge of Huckenfield Loch just a few weeks ago, and it stayed there the whole day. In fact, talking to other bird watchers, I had been there for a couple of days, and it was remarkable that despite the number of people visiting the loch, particularly in lockdown, and the number of people who ignore the rules and let their dogs off the loch and off the lead and into the loch, this bird did hang around for a few days and allowed me to get a reasonable photograph of it. This was a one-off. This was a first for Huckenfield. It was someone else that found it, and he kindly sent me a message to say, "I've just had a green sandpiper at Huckenfield Loch, Jim. Is that unusual?" And I said, "Andy, you've just had a first for the loch." So I twitched, ladies and gentlemen. I admit it. I rushed over to Huckenfield Loch and managed to see this green sandpiper. And that was the only photograph, the only reasonable photograph I got of it. It basically preferred the loch side where the vegetation is extremely thick, but there are one or two little bits you can look down on, and when I would look down on one of these little bits, I flushed accidentally this green sandpiper. So that was a new one for me and a new one for the loch. Now, Barons Hall, you can get 5, 6, 7, 8 green sandpipers. You can almost get them all year round. But as I say, in a Glasgow context and a Hugginfield Park context, this is an extremely rare bird. And oyster catchers, now they nest nearby, but they really liked these biohavens. And at one stage, I did think they were going to settle down and nest, but I think they decided to move off to the flat roofed buildings next to the playing fields owned by Strathclyde University. But they would come here to roost and to do a wee bit of feeding on some of the invertebrates which are attracted to this floating island. And they were probably the most regular sighted wader at Hugginfield. But again, in an area where there's very little mud or suitable places for waders, I think it was worth putting in their photograph in a talk about unusual species. Redshank, again on one of these floating biohavens, and along with pochard and tufted duck, for example. Only ever sighting of redshank at the park. There have been lots of sightings historically, where a lot of the wader species have been seen, but round about the 1950s and pre-1950s, since it became a local nature reserve, and more people have been visiting the park on a daily basis, the wader species aren't so numerous, and the numbers aren't so numerous, as it were. But this redshank, again, on this floating island. And I think that the last 3 photographs alone show the importance of having floating islands, not just for the wading birds here, but also for the duck species. And then here's a photograph of birds flying in towards the one of the floating islands. And as you can see, we've got black-headed gulls here. Black-headed gull, but goodness me, that looks like a tern. In fact, it's a sandwich tern. That's a sandwich tern. The sandwich terns at Hugginfield Loch. And for those who haven't got a big screen and can't see the detail, they actually landed on one of these biohavens. So you can see it here, the sandwich tern, sandwich tern, sandwich tern, and the head there of a sandwich tern. So at least 4 landed, and I believe there was at least 7. But it was difficult to count them as they were in amongst all the black-headed gulls. You could hear them calling, and it was a bit of a sort of I don't believe it type moment, but sure enough, the sandwich terns. And I've mentioned already the importance of ringing and looking at rings on gulls. And here's one, a black-headed gull at Hugginfield, and this one was ringed in Poland in 2019. So it shows you the distances birds will travel to get to such a wonderful location, such as Hugginfield Loch. Unbelievable. And talking of gulls, and again, John mentioned white-winged gulls. He gets lots of glaucous gulls where he is, and we were getting Iceland gulls. So here's an Iceland gull. You can see the nice wing there, no black on the primaries. And this is a more conventional photograph of one of the Iceland gulls. I think there was 2 appeared the particular winter that these photographs were taken, the winter of basically from 2020 into 2021, and you were getting really, really close views. And as I say, there was more than one. There were certainly 2 and possibly 3, because when you started looking at the various photographs people were posting, they weren't all the same bird. I mentioned the osprey at Frankfield Loch. I didn't actually take a photograph of an osprey at Hugginfield. This is a video grab, because I'd hoped that the osprey that had been visiting Frankfield would visit Hugginfield. So I had my camera preset on video on the off chance that an osprey or something else exciting might appear. And if you go into my YouTube channel, you'll find an osprey fishing at Hugginfield, catching a fish and flying off with it. So this is a video grab, so it's a really poor photograph, but as I said, I'm showing you the photographs of the actual bird at the actual location, rather than beautiful photographs of ospreys taken up in the north of Scotland or whatever. So moving on to wildfowl, because after all it is Huckenfield Loch and it's a great place to see wetland birds. Now, funnily enough, Frankfield Loch, just along the road, can have 30 up to 40, even I believe, shoveler on occasions. At Huckenfield, they're not at all common. And indeed, in the various times I visited Huckenfield from the 1st of April to the 30th of September, I only saw shoveler on 2 occasions. And that was basically the same week, where there was 13 one day and then I think 16 the next day. And then the next time I went, there was none. But the ones at Frankfield had gone from 15 to about 30. So it's not rocket science that the Huckenfield ones had moved on to Frankfield Loch. Frankfield, as I said, is a lot shallower and I think more conducive to the feeding patterns of shoveler. Although at this time Huckenfield was possibly at its lowest level, and that might explain why shoveler did turn up at Huckenfield Loch. Now, you've already seen a ring-necked duck at Bingham's Pond. You'll all recognise that bird as being a tufted duck. And you'll all look at that duck and say, that just looks like the bird Jim showed at Bingham's Pond. And it is a ring-necked duck. It's not the ring-necked duck, it was at Bingham's Pond, because at the same time as there was a bird at Bingham's Pond or Victoria Park, there was a bird in northeast Glasgow, either at the Gadloch or at Huckenfield Loch. And this is the bird that was at Huckenfield Loch, a lot further out than the one at Bingham's Pond, but you can still see the grey side to the body and the white flash going up the front or the side of the bird. And you can see quite clearly the difference, the shape of the bird and the coloration of the bird. For those who think it just looks like a tufted duck, clearly when you see them together, they're easy to distinguish. So moving on, scaup. Now, scaup are basically the sea equivalent of tufted ducks, and normally you see them, funnily enough, out at sea. Numbers have dwindled, and even when you go down to Ayrshire, when there used to be big numbers down at the Auchenharvey golf course area, they've fallen away. But to give you an idea of how common scaup have become, during all these visits, I saw scaup on 14 different occasions. And in some occasions, there was more than one bird, 2 females and a male, or a male and a female, and then single birds as well. So this is a female, and this is one of the males. And you can see there, again, they've got tufted ducks here. You can see the different markings, the vermiculations on the back and side of this drake bird. And the head shape is different as well if it was side on. So, so something to look out for when you're looking at the tufted ducks. And as I say, it's really quite good if you're counting the number of tufted ducks. That's when you tend to pick up the obscure species. If you just give a general glance, you could miss them. But if you're steadily working your way through counting 300 odd tufted ducks, then that's when you'll see something unusual. And in this case, the scaup. Another bird that turned up last autumn, or late on in the autumn, early winter, is a smew. And it arrived, or the first time I saw it was on the 17th of November, and it stayed up until early spring. And it's what's called a sawbill, so it's just like the goosander and red-breasted merganser, just a smaller version basically. A lovely little duck. And here's another view of it. So, moving on to grebe species, everyone will know that great crested grebes nest at Huckenfield Loch. They nest on the biohavens that the Friends of Glasgow's Local Nature Reserve installed a few years ago, but they also nest in the other biohavens that the Seven Lochs project put in following our demonstration project. The Seven Lochs project were so impressed with the outcome of our small efforts, the 5 small islands that they put in, another 5 larger islands, and great crested grebes have nested on 2 of their islands, nested in one of our islands, and a couple of pairs nest on natural locations as well, although they're not so successful because their nests can be flooded, whereas by nesting on the floating biohavens, they cannot be washed out. So this Slavonian grebe turned up to join the great crested grebes and the resident little grebes that are present, and came in its winter plumage, and was a very, very attractive bird with the bright red eye standing out. A lot of people will have been up to um, the north of Scotland or the Highlands, and you'll have seen the Slavonian grebe in its breeding plumage at its various breeding sites. So this is in its winter plumage, but the one thing that remains the same is the bright red eye. So I've mentioned 3 species of grebe so far, and this is one where never in my wildest dreams did I think that this would turn up in Glasgow. I have seen one at Balgrey Reservoir, but that was in winter plumage. But this is in breeding plumage, and it was just, as I said, quite astonishing that this bird. I found it on the 30th of June, and the photographs I took then just showed a bird sleeping right out at the island, so the photographs were very inconclusive. I asked various people on Facebook to go down with their telescopes, because I was just using my camera and binoculars, to go down and see what they could make of this bird. And I also posted my awful photographs on Facebook, and people confirmed it was a red-necked grebe. And all I'll say is that everyone else eventually ended up with superb photographs of this breeding plumage red-necked grebe, and mine were okay, but not up to the quality of people with top-notch cameras and happen to visit in brilliant sunshine, etc. But I'm quite pleased with these particular images, because it does show the salient features of the red-necked grebe, particularly the red neck and the yellow on the bill. And this is it now in winter plumage, because it did hang around for quite some time. In fact, I last saw it on the 4th of November 2020, so it did arrive on the 30th of June. And a lot of people think what happened basically was that on bonfire night, fireworks night, the 5th of November, a lot of birds did leave the loch. Some came back later on, but unfortunately the red-necked grebe didn't come back. But here it is with a great crested grebe, so you get an idea of the size difference. The red-necked grebe is smaller than the great crested grebe. As I say, this is in its non-breeding plumage, and that's what it looks like head on. This was one photograph I was quite happy with. It's just a pity that it was in its winter plumage, but you can see one of the diagnostic features, the bright yellow bill. So when you're at Musselburgh or Aberlady or Long Nidri, and you're looking out at sea and you see these little grebes, or small grebes, I should say, in the water, and you're not sure if they're Slavonian, if they're red-necked, or even black-necked grebes, look out for the colour of the bill, and that'll help you distinguish the species. So I'm coming up to the end of the talk, almost, ladies and gentlemen. So thanks for listening, those of you who are still here. Hopefully there's still a few of you out there, as it were. But out of the 97 bird species that I saw during this period, this was the most surprising and totally stunned me when I saw it. What I will say is that another birder, a good guy called Dean Stables, saw this bird, or another one, flying around the island and away from Hugginfield on a Wednesday. Now, he had no idea if it was flying over or if it had been at the loch. He just saw the bird flying away. He couldn't believe what it was, but he did report it. I went to Hugginfield on the Saturday looking for unusual species. I went there early, because the earlier you go, the more likely you are to find something a bit unusual. So this was the 1st of May. So I was hoping for some summer migrants maybe coming in to the grassland and the hedgerows on passage, or maybe a wader. And I was standing on the beach counting the ducks, and I then looked towards the island, and there was a big white bird sitting on the island. I just assumed it was going to be a little egret, which in itself would have been unbelievable, but it was a spoonbill. And as I say, I couldn't basically believe it. And I quickly got the news out on the Facebook pages, and was amazed that 2 people actually came up to me right away and said, "Excuse me, son, is that really a spoonbill up there?" And it turned out these were 2 chaps who walked around the loch every day. They didn't have binoculars, but they had a camera, and they saw this bird, and they photographed it as well. So we saw the bird. It then flew off, at which point lots of people arrived saying, "Jim, where's the bird?" I then got the feeling I was getting blamed for not forcing the bird to stay in the island. I did point out it had flown away, but not necessarily away from the loch, but away from where it had been perched. So one chap, the chap who found the green sandpiper, he decided to explore, and he ended up with the spoonbill flying over his head and having an incredible view, an incredible photograph of it. Luckily, the bird decided to come back to the island that night, roosted on the island, and the next morning there was lots of bird watchers looking at what could have been a white paper bag, apparently, because it roosted a lot further into the trees than it did when I saw it early on the morning of the 1st of May. But it was just an incredible sort of sighting that a spoonbill of all species should be in trees in a loch in Glasgow, less than 2 miles from Glasgow city centre. So at which point, as usual, you finish with a sunset. So Hugginfield Loch's so spectacular that I'm going to finish with 2 sunsets. So there we go, folks. To me, it's one of the best bird watching locations, as I've said, not just in Glasgow, but central Scotland. And I hope you enjoyed the talk. Thank you for listening. If you want more information about the sites mentioned in tonight's talk, that's the 4 sites, and details of future events that we're holding as a Friends Of group, then these are some website addresses. It might be too, we might not be able to take them down, but if you Google Friends of Glasgow's LNRs, you should be able to get hold of them. Or if you email Linda, that's Linda Pritchard, my wife, she can maybe send you out the details of these websites. And for example, we do have a wildfowl feeding at Hugginfield coming up on the 24th of October. We recently held a bird ringing session in conjunction with the Clyde Ringing Group at Hugginfield, where 49 birds were ringed, including sparrowhawk, blackcap, chiffchaff. In fact, 9 species of bird were ringed, and the ringing group were that pleased with what happened. They've asked me to sort out another date with them so we can have another ringing event in the forthcoming weeks at Hugginfield, and we'll hopefully have one at Dawson Park as well. So finally, I did mention that the Osprey is available as a video, as are lots of other videos from Glasgow area, and for that matter, around the world. And I do have a YouTube channel. And again, that's too complicated for you to write down. So again, if you're interested in looking up the videos that I've produced over the years, feel free to contact Linda and we can give you that particular link. So thanks very much, folks, and I'll answer any questions, hopefully. Thank you.